Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a look at a very unique type of visual deficit, motion and depth blindness. Could it unknowingly be influencing the sports we choose to play and the positions on the field we perform best at? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at a very unique type of visual deficit that you might have without even knowing it, and that if you were to step on a soccer pitch, might determine whether or not you'd be better suited to play on the left or right wing. Motion and depth blindness. Before I talk about what exactly this is, I want to look at the concept of visual channels that was first developed in theories of color vision. As I discussed way back in the very first episode of this podcast, when we talk about vision or seeing, we're actually referring to a set of different abilities which includes depth perception, the ability to see color, brightness perception, motion perception, etc. Research examining these different functions, in particular work on luminance and color vision, has revealed that they are processed largely independently and in parallel. That is, for the most part, our ability to process one aspect of a visual scene, say the movement of a ball, does not depend on our ability to process another aspect, say the color of the ball. Color and motion are perceived at the same time, but there is no crosstalk between them. This obviously makes total sense. You would not want to have to relearn how to receive a serve in tennis when someone switched the ball from yellow to white. Another way to think of this is that parallel, independent processing allows for high transferability of a skill. Once we're able to use motion information from an approaching ball to hit it, for example, its rate of expansion or the tau cue I've talked about several times, all the other aspects of our environment can be ignored. The motion information provided by the ball itself will be the same whether the background is a plain wall or thousands of cheering fans at Wimbledon, whether the ball is green or yellow, or whether we're playing at midday or under the lights. One point before I leave this idea of independence. You may have noticed that I said largely independently. Recent research, including some of my own, has shown that we can develop specific dependencies between different visual attributes in certain cases, and this can actually be advantageous. For example, in a couple different studies, I've shown that skilled baseball players seem to develop dependencies between the perception of time to contact, rotation, and the perception of direction. I discussed this in detail back in episode 6 if you're interested.
Simple sentences of conversation with the two minds. No dark location, so blind.
So far, I've been discussing how completely different visual attributes, for example, color, motion, brightness, etc., are processed within separate channels in the visual system. It also seems to be the case that we have processing channels, what you might call sub-channels, within each of these attributes. Again, using color vision as an example, most people are aware that color is processed by 3 channels, the red, green, and blue cones in our retina. This leads to one of the most interesting questions in the history of perception research. If we only have receptors for red, green, and blue in our eyes, why are there literally thousands and thousands of colors on display at a paint store? How can we see colors like purple or brown or orange when we can only detect red, green, and blue? You get varying estimates, but it's generally accepted that humans can distinguish over 1 million different colors. How is this possible with only 3 color channels? This is where the second important aspect of channel theory comes in, opponent processing. In our visual system, the outputs of the 3 color channels oppose each other. That is, they are combined in a manner such that their outputs cancel each other out, similar in the way to which your biceps and tricep muscles work in your arm. If you contracted both of these muscles at the same time, nothing would happen because they oppose each other. This gives us the answer to the million color problem. We can see millions of colors because each one produces a unique combination of outputs from the 3 channels. This also explains why we get negative after images when we stare at one color for a long time. If you look at a patch of red for a minute or so, you will essentially fatigue the red channel in your visual system. This will make its opponent color, green, temporarily stronger, so that when you look at a white surface, you will see a green patch. When the red channel fatigue goes away, the 2 opponent channels will be in balance again and you will just see white. I've included an image of an American flag after effect you can try if you've never done one of these. Beyond color vision, more recent research has shown that we seem to have similar sub-channels for other visual attributes. Referring back to episode 39A, where I discussed contrast sensitivity functions, we seem to have distinct channels for different ranges of spatial frequencies. Turning to motion perception, work by my PhD supervisor Martin Regan and Ken Beverly showed that we have separate channels for leftwards, rightwards, upwards, and downwards motion in the 2-dimensional plane directly in front of us, and that by combining the outputs from these motion channels in an opponent process, we can easily detect whether or not an object is approaching us or not. Specifically, if all of the left, right, and top-bottom edges of an object have outward motion at the same speed, the retinal image is expanding and it's going to hit us. So, to sum up this first part of the episode, visual channel theory includes 3 basic ideas. First, different visual attributes, for example color and motion, are processed independently and in parallel. Second, different aspects within a visual attribute, for example different colors or different directions of motion, are processed independently and in parallel in the early stages of visual processing, and then combined in an opponent fashion later on to allow the different aspects to be discriminated with a high level of precision. Third, and finally, is a point that I haven't really discussed. That is, we have completely separate and independent channels for each location in our visual field. That is why that all of the color and motion after effect demos you see tell you to stare at a certain point in the image. If you move your eyes around when looking at the image, you are actually stimulating different sets of visual channels all the time, so they'll never get fatigued. For a great discussion of the implications of visual channel theory, of which there are many more than I have discussed, I would recommend you check out Martin Regan's Prentice Award paper, link in the show notes. I've also included a figure from this paper which illustrates the basic ideas I've discussed here.
Yeah, your words are so meaningless, and I find you faceless. If I could see you, you're too close to me. If I could hear you, you're talking too loud. If I could see you, you're too close to me.
Okay, let's now turn to the topic of motion and depth blindness. One of the consequences of visual channel theory is that it creates the possibility for some very specific and somewhat odd types of visual loss or blindness. If one of the channels is damaged in some way, we could lose the ability to perceive one aspect of vision while all other aspects are fine. The most well-known example of this is, of course, color blindness. Most people that are colorblind have normal motion perception, brightness perception, depth perception, etc. At the next level down, if one of the sub-channels within a specific visual attribute gets damaged, we could lose the ability to perceive only a very specific set of visual stimuli. An example of this can be seen in multiple sclerosis. If we do a contrast sensitivity test for a patient with MS, they're often very good at discriminating high spatial frequencies, but poor for low ones, which results in a very distinct notch in their contrast sensitivity function. Finally, because we have separate channels for different locations in our visual field, it is possible that we could have abnormal perception only when an object is in a very specific location, say 20 degrees to the left of center. When we have a problem in a specific location, we typically call it a blind spot or scotoma. Blind spots are actually quite difficult to identify, and many people have them without knowing it. Why? Again, because of eye movements. If I have a blind spot 20 degrees to the left of center, a particular object would only be in that location very, very briefly if I move my eyes around. To detect blind spots, we need to use a technique you may have experienced yourself in an eye exam, visual perimetry. In this type of test, the participant's head is immobilized, for example with a chin rest, and they're asked to stare straight ahead. You then present visual stimuli, for whichever function you want to measure, at random locations in the visual field and ask them to say whether they saw it or not. In 1985, Martin Regan and colleagues used this perimetry technique to measure sensitivity to motion and depth. In this case, the motion was generated by changing the binocular disparity of a small target, what we typically call stereo motion. What they found was quite remarkable. For most of the people they tested, there were very distinct areas in the visual field for which the person was motion and depth blind. In other words, if they kept looking straight ahead and an object was approaching from this exact location, they would not detect it was coming at them. I have included a diagram of Martin's own motion and depth perimetry test, which shows that he has a large horseshoe-shaped blind spot for motion and depth. In addition to this perceptual effect, they also often found associated eye movement consequences. When you present a motion and depth stimulus to a participant, it typically leads to a vergence eye movement. Our eyes turn inwards to track the approaching object. When the object was presented in one of the blind spots, this vergence system was not activated in Martin's studies. Consistent with visual channel theory, when they measured other aspects of visual performance, it was normal in these same locations. For example, within its horseshoe motion and depth scotoma, Martin has normal acuity, depth perception, and frontal plane motion perception. Surprisingly, these blind spots seem to be quite common. In one study, only 5 out of 16 participants had no visual deficits for motion and depth. In a study published in Psychological Science a few months ago, Berendrecht and colleagues conducted stereo motion perimetry for 11 participants. This study involved the use of random dot stimuli, so that changes in binocular disparity could be separated from interocular velocity differences in the two eyes. Please listen to episode 5 for a more detailed discussion of the difference between these two visual cues. On each trial, the participant's task was to indicate whether the object was approaching or receding. What was found? Similar to Regan and colleagues' original findings, 7 out of the 11 of the participants had a stereo motion scotoma in at least one location in their visual field. Also, like Martin's findings, the drop-off in performance could be quite dramatic, as areas for which a participant could perform the test perfectly and blind spots were often separated by only 1 degree of visual angle, or about the size of your thumbnail. Again, this is consistent with the idea that we have very distinct and independent channels at different locations in the visual field. This recent study adds to the story by showing that these blind spots seem to be the result of an impairment in the ability to compare the speed of retinal motion in the two eyes, aka interocular velocity differences. These impairments in comparing the motion between the two eyes were not due to general impairments in motion perception, as thresholds for 2D motion were again normal.
Every time I look at you, I go blind. Every time I look at you, I go blind.
Okay, so you are an athlete and you have one of these motion and depth blind spots. What effect is it going to have? Well, despite me rambling on about it for several minutes now, it's quite possible it could have no effect at all for a couple reasons. First, as I have already discussed, typically eye movements would ensure that objects are only in our blind spot for a fraction of a second. Although, that amount of time can be quite critical in sports. A second reason these blind spots might not be a big deal is that we have a redundant alternative system for detecting motion and depth, detecting changing size or tau. In Regan and colleagues' studies, in most but not all cases, sensitivity to changing size was normal in areas for which participants had stereo motion blind spots. However, as I discussed in detail back in episode 5, there are some situations in which stereo motion cues are more effective than changing size or tau, in particular when you have a small, fast-moving object. So in some cases, motion and depth blindness could be affecting an athlete's performance even though they might be completely unaware of it. Even more interesting to me is the idea I hinted at the beginning of today's episode. maybe motion and depth blind spots can influence an athlete's choice of position or stance in sports. For example, if you had a motion scotoma on the right side of your visual field, maybe it would lead you to choose to play right wing in sports like hockey or soccer, so you can keep everything on your left when attacking. Or, if you had a blind spot in your left visual field, maybe it would lead you to bat left-handed in baseball, so your right visual field is closest to the pitcher. This latter example is actually what got me intrigued by this issue many years ago. I actually bat left-handed in baseball, despite being right-hand dominant, and discovered during my PhD that I do have a motion and depth blind spot in my left visual field. I've always wanted to do a large-scale study looking at the relationship between motion and depth blindness and position choice in sport, but never quite got around to it. So anyone looking for an experiment idea, there's a freebie. Well, that'll wrap up today's episode. Coming soon on the Perception and Action podcast, my top 5 sports psychology stories of 2016. Contact me on Twitter at ShakyWeights or by email robgray@asu.edu. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.